This Sunday we're looking at Job chapter 37. It's an exciting chapter because it makes us think about how God speaks to us. Elihu, who represents God and who's about to disappear from the scene actually, as we'll see next week, is speaking God's word into Job's life. And the main topic of this chapter is God's voice. What does it sound like? How can we hear it? The way God speaks to us is a spiritual thing and it's difficult to describe. However, Elihu uses the image of sound, the sound of thunder, being used to describe God's voice. Perhaps considering the nature of sound might give us some personal insights into how to understand and how to listen to God. I understand there are 6 properties of sound. They are the pitch, the volume, the timbre, the articulation, the duration, and the direction. Here's a graph from a sound analysis program I used to use as a linguist. The left-hand axis gives you the frequency or the pitch. You could say it's the note or the main message. The horizontal axis gives you the duration or the time in seconds, and the intensity of the darkness on the actual graph gives you the volume. Let me use this graph to give some thoughts on how God might be speaking to each of us today. Firstly, pitch, volume and timbre. Pitch is the note or the message. This graph shows a picture of a person singing 8 syllables. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The pitch of each word can be read from the left line. What is interesting is that a spectrogram shows us that any note is actually made up of other notes at different frequencies that are happening at the same time but at lower volumes. And that's what's called timbre. And as I said, the volume's shown by the intensity of the colour. So what's the spiritual application? Well, maybe God's message to us is more than just the roar of the thunder. When something happens in your life, can you look beyond the loudest note and hear the full timbre? Just like Elijah, who found that God's voice was not in the thunder, but in the small, quiet voice within him. Or maybe the opposite is happening. Instead of focusing on the clear message that God's trying to give to you, do you get distracted and hurt by the minor details? I intend to give you an example, but more important is that you ask God now for your own example. What is He saying to you that you're missing in the roar of the thunder? Or maybe that you're being distracted from by the minor message that you're picking up? How about articulation, duration and direction? Well, articulation is just the way a sound begins and then fades. Each of the 8 syllables in the spectrogram have their own articulation or envelope of sound. A piano articulates the same note quite differently to a violin, and yet it's the same note. I wonder if God may be speaking to you, but you do not recognise the articulation. It may be coming from a person or a circumstance in your life that you haven't considered as a way that God might speak to you. The duration of the sound is also important. Is this a one-off thought or is it something consistent and ongoing? If there's a message or a thought or an idea that keeps on coming to you, maybe now's the time to recognise that and either reject it or receive it. Which brings me to the final property of sound, direction. Where does sound come from? My spectrogram can't show us that, but there is an obvious way to find out. If we could see where the microphone was pointed at. It's the same with our lives. If our input comes from shallow, negative, critical sources, then that's the sound we'll be processing. If our input comes from the Bible, taking time out to reflect on life and from mixing with trustworthy and godly friends, then we can expect positive input and have some assurance that the message we're hearing is coming from God's direction. I'd like to finish by looking at chapter 37 verse 13 to think about 3 reasons or 3 messages that God may have for us. He causes it to come, whether for correction or for His land or for His mercy, chesed. And in the context of the passage, it's talking about the rain falling upon the earth. But it's the same with any kind of message that God may have for us. Sometimes God speaks to us because He wants us to change our ways. Other times it's just simply natural that God's speaking into His creation according to the laws of the universe. And when He speaks like that, an example is just going out into nature and enjoying the goodness and the greatness of God. But both of these messages have an ultimate meaning, and that God is gracious, that His plan for our lives and for the universe is based upon mercy and love, and that love is ultimately found in God appearing on this earth through Jesus Christ.